war in the Arctic is a special chapter in the Great Patriotic War. Here, beyond the Arctic Circle, in the frozen Arctic, the fate of the northern borders of the USSR was decided. The Northern Fleet, the youngest and smallest, stood up to defend Murmansk, the key to the northern sea routes. Submariners in steel coffins hunted enemy convoys. Allied caravans carried tanks and aircraft under a hail of bombs, without which victory would have been impossible. Every crossing of the Barents Sea could have been the last. The Marines held their ground where it seemed impossible to survive. This allowed the fleet to survive 4 years in the harshest conditions on the planet. If you are interested in the history of the Great Patriotic War and little-known pages of the heroic defense of our homeland, subscribe to the WWII channel and like this video. And in the comments, let's discuss a controversial issue. Was the British Admiralty's decision to disperse convoy PQ-17 correct? Or was it a fatal mistake that doomed the defenseless transports to destruction? Could the actions have been different? I look forward to your opinions in the comments. The Soviet Union's Northern Fleet was the youngest of the country's 4 fleets. It was officially established on May 11, 1937, when the Northern Military Flotilla was granted full fleet status. By that time, there was already a small group of warships based in Murmansk and the village of Polyarny, which became the fleet's main naval base. Its geographical location determined the unique role of this fleet. It was located in close proximity to the Northern Sea communications connecting the USSR with its allies through the Arctic. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the Northern Fleet was significantly inferior in power to other fleets of the country. It consisted of 8 destroyers, 15 submarines of the Shchuka, Malyutka, and Pravda types, 7 patrol ships, and several dozen minesweepers and submarine hunters. The fleet's aviation unit had 116 aircraft of various types, including fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Coastal defenses included several batteries of large-caliber guns covering the approaches to Murmansk and Polyarny. The personnel numbered almost 30,000, but most of the sailors had no combat experience. From June 1940, the Northern Fleet was commanded by Rear Admiral Arseny Golovko, an experienced naval officer who had served in the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. It was he who was to lead the fleet during the most difficult period in its history. Golovko understood that in the event of war, the fleet would have to operate in extremely difficult conditions: polar storms, long winter nights, short summers with the sun never setting, when it was impossible to hide the movement of ships. The Arctic climate was unforgiving to people and equipment. Winter temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Winds reached hurricane force, and waves in the Barents Sea rose to the height of a multi-story building. The main base of the fleet was Polyarny, protected by the rocky shores of Ekaterinskaya Harbor. Repair workshops, ammunition depots, barracks, and the fleet headquarters were located here. Murmansk, the largest city above the Arctic Circle, was the main port through which cargo flows passed. Its ice-free harbor was of strategic importance. It was the only year-round port in the north of the USSR through which aid could be received from future allies. In addition, the fleet had auxiliary bases in Iokanga and on Dixon Island, which allowed it to control the western section of the Northern Sea route. The Northern Fleet's adversary was to be the German Kriegsmarine, whose forces in Norway significantly outnumbered the Soviet ones. After the occupation of Norway in April 1940, the Germans gained excellent bases in the Norwegian fjords: Kirkenes, Petsamo, Tromsø, and Narvik. Modern destroyers and Type 7 submarines were based here, and later heavy surface ships, including the battleship Tirpitz, would also appear. German aviation dominated the skies, with airfields near the Soviet border. The Luftwaffe had Junkers 88 bombers and Junkers 87 dive bombers capable of striking ships and ports. The Soviet command understood that in the event of war, the main task of the Northern Fleet would be to defend Murmansk and communications along the Kola Peninsula. The fleet was also supposed to hinder German transport along the Norwegian coast, where convoys carrying ore from Kirkenes to Germany passed. Submarines were seen as the main striking force of the fleet. They could operate covertly in the coastal waters of Norway, attacking enemy transports. Due to their small numbers, surface ships were to be used to guard communications and support coastal troops. In the spring of 1941, the fleet conducted exercises, practicing coordination with land forces and coastal defenses. Submariners went out to sea, training in torpedo attacks on simulated targets. Naval aviators mastered bombing and torpedo strikes. But peacetime was rapidly coming to an end. Intelligence reported the concentration of German troops in northern Norway and the movement of enemy ships along the coast. The sailors of the Northern Fleet were preparing for war, not knowing that it would begin in a few weeks and last for almost 4 years. Would they be able to withstand the superior forces of the enemy in the harsh Arctic conditions? On June 22, 1941, war came to the north later than to other parts of the Soviet border. German troops began their offensive in the Arctic only on June 29th, a week after the start of Operation Barbarossa. The delay was due to the need to regroup the German Army Norway and Finnish units that were to operate in this direction. The goal of the offensive was to capture Murmansk, an ice-free port through which the USSR could receive aid from its Western allies. The loss of Murmansk would have deprived the Soviet Union of its most important logistical center in the north. The Northern Fleet entered the war in a state of heightened combat readiness. On June 19th, Commander Golovko received a directive about a possible attack and brought the fleet to combat readiness. When the first reports of the outbreak of war came in, the ships were already in their combat positions. Submarines were ordered to proceed to their designated areas and begin searching for the enemy. Surface ships stood guard over the approaches to Murmansk and Polyarny. The Air Force began patrolling the airspace. The Northern Fleet pilots made their first combat sortie on the morning of June 22nd. A reconnaissance group was sent to the Norwegian coast to detect enemy ship movements. The German command planned a quick capture of Murmansk by General Edvard Dietl's Norway Mountain Corps. This corps became famous for its capture of Narvik in 1940 and was considered an elite unit specially trained for operations in Arctic conditions. The offensive was to develop in 2 directions, across the western Litsa River, directly to Murmansk, and along the coast of the Arctic Ocean to the Sredny and Rybachi peninsulas. The capture of these peninsulas would open the way to bypass Soviet defenses from the north. The Germans counted on the speed of the operation, believing that the small number of Soviet troops would not be able to offer serious resistance. However, the offensive stalled almost immediately. The 14th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Valerian Alexandrovich Frolov, which was covering the Murmansk direction, took up well-prepared defensive positions. The fleet's coastal artillery supported the ground forces with fire on the advancing enemy. Destroyers and patrol boats approached the coast and fired on German columns with their ships' guns. The Northern Fleet's Marines fought shoulder to shoulder with Army soldiers, holding key heights. Already in the first days, it became clear that the Germans would not be able to take Murmansk on the march. The fleet suffered its first losses almost immediately. On June 24th, German bombers raided Polyarny. The targets of the attack were ships in the harbor and coastal facilities. Although anti-aircraft artillery shot down several aircraft, bombs hit the destroyer Stremitelny, which was seriously damaged. 16 sailors were killed and another 38 were wounded. This was the first bloodshed by sailors of the Northern Fleet in the new war. The raids continued in the following days. The Luftwaffe methodically bombed Murmansk, trying to destroy the port and deprive the fleet of its supply base. The city was burning, but the port continued to operate. Submarines began combat missions in the first days of the war. The submarine M-171, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Vasily Grigorievich Starikov, entered the Varanger Fjord, a bay in occupied Norway, where the German naval base of Kirkenes was located. The task was to detect and attack enemy ships supplying the advancing German troops. On June 30th, the M-171 detected a German transport and attacked it with torpedoes, but there were no hits. The torpedoes missed their target. This was the first combat attack by a Soviet submarine in the north, albeit unsuccessful. Experience in submarine warfare was just beginning to accumulate. The naval aviation was more successful. On July 3rd, a group of SB bombers, covered by fighters, attacked German fuel depots in the Petsamo area. The strike was accurate. Explosions and fires were visible for tens of kilometers. The enemy's fuel losses hampered the supply of the advancing troops. On July 7th, torpedo bombers attacked a German convoy off the coast of Norway, sinking a transport ship with a tonnage of about 3,000 tons. Each such victory contributed to the overall defense effort. Pilots learned to fight in conditions where the enemy had superiority in the air. By the end of July, it was clear that the German offensive on Murmansk had failed. The front stabilized in the area of the western Litsa River, just 50 kilometers from the city. The Germans did not advance any further. The Sredny and Rybachi peninsulas remained in Soviet hands, despite fierce attacks. The Northern Fleet played a decisive role in this success. Its ships and aircraft prevented the enemy from bringing in reinforcements by sea, while coastal artillery destroyed troop concentrations. Murmansk remained Soviet, which meant that the way was open for future Allied convoys. But the war in the north was just beginning, and years of severe trials lay ahead. Would the fleet's submarines be able to inflict serious damage on German communications in the Norwegian Sea? The submarine forces of the Northern Fleet were the youngest, and at the same time the most dangerous service in the north. At the start of the war, the fleet had 15 submarines of various types and classes. 7 of them were small M-type submarines, Malyutka, with a displacement of only 280 tons in surface position. These tiny submarines could dive to a depth of 50 meters and were armed with 2 533mm torpedo tubes. Their cruising range was about 3,000 miles, which allowed them to operate off the coast of Norway. The Malyutka's crew consisted of only 20 people, who spent weeks of autonomous navigation in a cramped steel cylinder. Medium submarines of the Shach type, Shchuka, formed the backbone of the submarine force. There were 8 of them. The Shchuka had a displacement of 700 tons in surface position, carried 4 torpedo tubes, and could carry up to 12 torpedoes. Its diving depth was 90 meters, which gave it some advantage in evading depth charges. Their cruising range exceeded 4,000 miles, allowing them to make long voyages. The crew consisted of 45 people. The Shchuka-class submarines were reliable, although not the fastest boats. Their maximum speed on the surface was 14 knots and 8 knots underwater. Service on submarines in Arctic conditions was a test of endurance. In winter, the air temperature dropped to -30 to 40 degrees, and the icy wind penetrated to the bone. When surfacing, the conning tower was instantly covered with ice. The mechanisms froze, and the hatches froze so tightly that they had to be opened with sledgehammers. The watch on the bridge could stay there for no more than 15 to 20 minutes, after which they were replaced. Otherwise, frostbite was inevitable. Inside the boat, there was constant dampness from condensation caused by temperature differences. Clothes never dried completely, and people lived in wet uniforms for weeks. The polar night, lasting from November to January, made combat missions particularly difficult. The round-the-clock darkness was disorienting and disrupted the body's biological rhythms. The submariners lost track of time without seeing the sun. The psychological strain was enormous. The confined space, constant tension, and inability to see the sky and horizon. Only dim lights inside the compartments and instrument panels with glowing arrows provided some light. In summer, the opposite problem arose: the polar day, when the sun did not set below the horizon. This made it difficult to remain covert, as the boat was visible even at night in the bright waters. It was necessary to dive for the entire daylight period, which increased electricity consumption. Storms in the Barents Sea were particularly fierce. Waves reached heights of 10 to 12 meters, covering the bridge and washing everything unsecured into the water. The small malyutkas were tossed about like splinters, and keeping them on course required superhuman efforts on the part of the helmsman. Inside the boat, people and objects flew from side to side. Many were so seasick that they could not eat for several days in a row. But surfacing during a storm was even more dangerous. A wave could overwhelm the wheelhouse, flood the diesel engines, and the boat would sink. Therefore, it was often necessary to wait out the storm underwater at a depth where the rocking was less noticeable. The technical condition of the boats often left much to be desired. Many mechanisms were operating at their limits, and there was a shortage of spare parts. The batteries that powered the boat underwater wore out quickly, and their capacity declined. This limited the time spent underwater. If at the beginning of the war, the boat could run on electric motors for a day at low speed, by the end of the voyage this time was reduced to a few hours. After that, it was necessary to surface and recharge the batteries from diesel engines, which made the boat vulnerable to detection. The air regeneration systems did not work well, and the carbon dioxide content in the compartments often exceeded the norm, causing headaches and weakness. Submarine commanders were a special caste of sailors. They bore full responsibility for the ship and crew, making decisions in conditions of incomplete information and constant danger. A submariner needed not only a naval education, but also an engineering mindset, psychological stability, and intuition. Many commanders of the Northern Fleet were young, between 25 and 30 years old. They learned to fight directly in combat missions, where the price of a mistake was the death of the entire crew. Of the 15 boats that went to war, 3 did not return by the end of 1941. It was a harsh lesson. Submarine warfare did not forgive mistakes. The crews lived as one family. In the cramped quarters of the boat, there was no personal space, and everyone slept in turns on the same bunks. A system of hot bunks. The food was monotonous: canned food, biscuits, sometimes soup. Fresh water was strictly rationed, and they were able to wash once a week, and even then, not everyone. But it was precisely in these conditions that true brotherhood was born. The submariners knew that everyone's life depended on the actions of everyone else. One wrong turn of the wheel, one valve closed at the wrong time, and the boat might not surface. Therefore, discipline was ironclad, but based on mutual respect and trust. Everyone knew their post and their duties by heart. Would this close-knit team be able to withstand all the trials of submarine warfare? The first success of the Northern Fleet submariners came on July 14, 1941. The submarine Shach 402, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Nikolai Grigorievich Stolbov, was patrolling the coastal waters of Norway near Cape Nordkapp. The purpose of the voyage was to search for German transports supplying troops advancing on Murmansk. In the afternoon, the watch officer spotted smoke on the horizon. Stolbov ordered the submarine to dive to periscope depth and begin closing in. An hour later, it became clear that this was a convoy of 3 transports escorted by 2 patrol ships. The submarine took up position for attack. Attacking a convoy under escort required exceptional skill and composure. The commander had to calculate the target's course, speed, distance, and take into account the current and sea conditions. The slightest mistake, and the torpedo would miss. Stolbov chose as his main target a large transport with a displacement of about 4,000 tons. sailing in the center of the convoy. 2 torpedoes were fired from a distance of 800 meters. The waiting time seemed like an eternity. After 1 minute and 40 seconds, there was a dull explosion. A hit! A second explosion sounded a few seconds later. The transport ship was holed in the engine room area and began to sink rapidly. A counterattack began immediately. The escort ships rushed to the presumed site of the attack, their sonar trying to locate the submarine. The Shach 402 sank to the bottom at a depth of 70 meters. The crew froze in silence. Any noise could give away the boat's position. A few minutes later, depth charges began to explode. The first series missed, but the next was more accurate. The blows shook the hull, lights went out, and paint flaked off the bulkheads. In one of the compartments, a gasket leaked, and a thin stream of water gushed out under pressure. The mechanics quickly plugged the hole with a wooden stopper. The bombing continued for over an hour. A total of about 30 depth charges were dropped, but none of them hit their target. When the sound of the enemy's propellers faded away, the boat surfaced and set course back to base. The sinking of the first transport was an important moral victory. The Fleet Command realized that the submarine forces were capable of dealing significant blows to the enemy. Stolbov received the Order of the Red Banner, and the crew was awarded. But most importantly, the tactics of attacking convoys in coastal waters had been worked out. The experience of the Shach 402 was studied by other submarine commanders. The understanding was that it was necessary to act decisively, but after the attack, immediately dive to maximum depth and break away from pursuers. The time to retreat after a torpedo salvo should not exceed 30 seconds. Submarine warfare tactics in the north had their own peculiarities. The main area of operation was the coast of Norway, from Cape Nordkapp to Varanger Fjord. German convoys carrying ore from the Kirkenes mines, troops, ammunition, and fuel passed through here. The convoys sailed along the coast, using the numerous fjords as natural shelters. Submarines had to operate in confined coastal waters, where depths often did not exceed 50 to 80 meters. This made it impossible to dive deep when evading pursuit. In addition, the coastal waters were heavily mined by the Germans, which created an additional danger. Soviet commanders developed a method of positional attack. The boat took up a position on the convoy's presumed route, submerged to periscope depth, and waited. Sometimes the wait lasted for a day. To save energy, the boat would settle on the bottom, turning off all mechanisms except the most necessary ones. The crew remained completely silent. When the sonar detected the noise of propellers, the boat would surface to periscope depth. The commander would determine the parameters of the target and launch an attack. After the salvo, it would immediately dive and move away. If the pursuit became too persistent, the boat would settle on the bottom and wait until the enemy stopped searching. Another method was cruising in a designated area. The boat remained on the surface most of the time to conserve battery power. When a target was detected, the boat would approach at high speed while on the surface, then dive and attack. This method was effective in the summer during the polar day, when good visibility allowed targets to be detected from a distance. However, it also made the boat vulnerable to enemy aircraft. The Germans patrolled their communications with seaplanes and bombers. When they spotted a submarine, they attacked with bombs and depth charges. Several boats were damaged in such attacks, and one was lost. By the end of the summer of 1941, the Submariners of the Northern Fleet had sunk about 10 enemy transports and auxiliary vessels with a total tonnage of approximately 20,000 tons. These were modest figures compared to the German submarines in the Atlantic, but for a young fleet, it was a significant result. Each ship sunk meant cargo that did not reach the German army and fuel that was not available for the offensive. Soviet submariners learned to fight, gained experience, and improved their tactics. Years of even more intense submarine warfare lay ahead. But it was already clear that German communications in the Norwegian Sea were not invulnerable. Would the Allies be able to help the USSR by delivering cargo through the Arctic? And what role would the Northern Fleet play in protecting these convoys? In the summer of 1941, when German troops were rapidly advancing into the Soviet Union, the question of assistance from the Western Allies became vital. On July 12th, a Soviet-British agreement on joint action against Germany was signed in Moscow. Great Britain, which had been fighting the Nazis alone in Europe since 1940, saw a new ally in the USSR. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite his critical attitude toward communism, understood that the fall of the Soviet Union would make Germany's victory inevitable. Therefore, the British government decided to provide the USSR with all possible assistance in the form of military supplies. The main route for delivering cargo was the northern route through the Arctic to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. This route was the shortest. Transports left the ports of Iceland and Scotland, passed along the coast of Norway, through the Norwegian and Barents Seas, and arrived at Soviet ports. The journey took about 12 to 14 days. Alternative routes through the Persian Gulf and Iran, or through the Pacific Ocean and Vladivostok, were much longer and took months. The northern route allowed for fast delivery of cargo, which was critically important in the context of the unfolding disaster on the Soviet-German front. The first Arctic convoy, designated Dervish, left the Icelandic port of Reykjavik on August 21, 1941. It consisted of 7 transports escorted by several British warships. The convoy carried 15 Hurricane fighters, which were stored in the holds in disassembled form, as well as tanks, ammunition, medicines, and various military equipment. The convoy was commanded by an experienced British admiral who was well aware of the dangers of Arctic navigation. The route passed through waters controlled by German aircraft based in Norway and through areas patrolled by German submarines. The voyage was relatively calm. The Germans had not yet realized the importance of the northern convoys and had not concentrated enough forces against them. On August 31st, the convoy arrived safely in Arkhangelsk. Unloading began immediately. The fighters were assembled by Soviet technicians in just a few days and transferred to combat units. The tanks were sent to the front by rail. The first batch of aid, though small, became a symbol that the USSR was not alone in the struggle. The success of the Dervish demonstrated the fundamental possibility of Arctic deliveries. A regular convoy system began in September. They were assigned alphanumeric designations. Convoys going to the USSR were given the index PQ, followed by a serial number, PQ1, PQ2, and so on. Convoys returning from Soviet ports were designated QP. The convoys were formed in Iceland, where the most dangerous part of the journey began. The number of ships in a convoy varied from 10 to 30 or 40. British destroyers, corvettes, and minesweepers provided protection. Larger convoys were accompanied by cruisers and sometimes battleships, which sailed at a distance, ready to come to the rescue in case of an attack by German surface ships. The cargoes carried by the convoys were vital for the continuation of the war. Matilda and Valentine tanks, American Shermans, arriving under the Lend-Lease program. Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, bombers, torpedo bombers. Thousands of Studebaker, Ford, and Dodge trucks, which would become the backbone of the Soviet military automotive industry. Ammunition of all calibers, from rifle cartridges to heavy artillery shells, high-octane aviation gasoline, aluminum for aircraft production, copper for shell casings, food, canned meat, sugar, flour. Each transport carried hundreds or even thousands of tons of cargo. The Soviet command understood the value of these supplies very well. The Northern Fleet was tasked with meeting the convoys in the Barents Sea and escorting them to port. To this end, Destroyers and patrol boats were assigned from the fleet to meet the convoys in the Medvezy Island area and escort them further. Soviet aircraft patrolled the airspace, protecting the convoys from German bombers. Submarines took up positions off the Norwegian coast, attacking German ships and drawing the enemy's attention. In the fall of 1941, convoys sailed one after another. PQ-1 arrived on September 28th, delivering tanks and aircraft. PQ-2 arrived at the end of October. By the end of the year, about 10 convoys had arrived in Soviet ports, delivering hundreds of tanks, more than 1,000 aircraft, and tens of thousands of tons of various cargo. This was a drop in the ocean compared to the needs of the front, but every tank and every aircraft mattered. British and American cargo helped to plug gaps in the defenses and replenish the losses of equipment that had been destroyed in the terrible battles near Moscow, Leningrad, and in Ukraine. The Germans quickly realized the importance of the northern convoys and began to concentrate their forces to destroy them. New submarines were relocated to the Norwegian fjords. Aviation was strengthened, and surface ships were prepared for action. The battle for the Arctic convoys was just beginning, and the bloodiest clashes were ahead. But it was already clear that this route would become a lifeline for the USSR, and the Northern Fleet would defend this lifeline at any cost. Would the convoy system withstand the blow that the Germans were preparing to deliver in the spring and summer of 1942? Convoy PQ-17 became the most tragic page in the history of Arctic convoys. On June 27, 1942, a convoy of 36 transport ships left the Icelandic port of Hvalfjord. They were carrying almost 200,000 tons of military cargo: tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food. The escort consisted of 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 anti-submarine trawlers, and 2 submarines. In addition, a cover squadron led by the battleship Duke of York and the aircraft carrier Victorious sailed at a distance. It was one of the largest convoys of the entire war. The first days of the voyage passed quietly. The convoy moved northward along the edge of the polar ice, trying to stay away from the Norwegian Luftwaffe bases. But on July 1st, the convoy was spotted by German reconnaissance aircraft. From that moment on, a methodical pursuit began. German planes constantly hovered over the convoy, transmitting its coordinates. On July 2nd, the first attacks began. Wave after wave of Junkers, 87 dive bombers, and Heinkel 111 torpedo bombers descended on the convoy. 2 transports were sunk, and 1 was damaged. On July 3rd, the British Admiralty received intelligence reports that the German battleship Tirpitz had left the Norwegian fjord of Altenfjord, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and several destroyers. This information caused panic at headquarters. The Tirpitz, with a displacement of 42,000 tons and 8 380mm guns, could single-handedly destroy the entire convoy. The British escort ships had no chance against it. The covering squadron with the battleship was too far away and would not be able to come to the rescue in time. At 9 p.m. on July 4th, Admiral Dudley Pound, 1st Sea Lord, made a fateful decision. He ordered the escort squadron to move west and the convoy to disperse, with each ship proceeding to its destination independently. The escort was to leave the transports and join the squadron. This decision effectively doomed the defenseless merchant ships to destruction. The commander of the escort, Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton, was horrified. But an order is an order. At 10:21 p.m., he transmitted the signal: convoy to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. At 22:36, escort to move west at maximum speed. The transports were left alone in the Barents Sea. The ship captains did not understand what was happening. Why were the warships abandoning them? Chaos ensued. 36 ships scattered in all directions, losing their organized defense. Each followed its own course, hoping for luck. But the Germans already knew of their helplessness. On July 5th, a massive destruction began. German submarines, of which there were more than a dozen in the area, attacked the defenseless transports one after another. The Air Force delivered blow after blow. Ships burned, exploded, and sank in the icy water. The American transport Washington tried to take cover at the edge of the ice, but was caught by the submarine U-456. A torpedo hit the engine room. The ship sank in 8 minutes. The crew barely had time to lower the lifeboats. The British Imperial Byron was attacked by torpedo bombers. 3 torpedoes tore through its side. The explosion of ammunition in the holds broke the ship in half. The Panamanian ship Hohenberg was hit by a bomb in the hold containing aviation gasoline. A fireball shot up hundreds of meters. None of the crew survived. One after another, the ships sank, taking tanks, planes, trucks, and food with them to the bottom. Some transports tried to make their way individually along the northern coast of Novaya Zemlya. They sailed through the ice, using it as cover from attacks. Several ships reached Novaya Zemlya and took refuge in Belushia Guba Bay, where they were discovered by the Soviet icebreaker Alexander Sibiryakov. Others tried to break through directly to Arkhangelsk. The few survivors encountered Soviet escort ships only on July 8-9. The destroyers Gremyashchi and Sokrushiteli, commanded by Captain First Rank Arseny Georgievich Vaniev, left Murmansk to assist the remnants of the convoy. They picked up survivors from the sunken ships and repelled several attacks by German bombers. Of the 36 transports of PQ-17, only 11 reached Soviet ports. 24 ships were sunk by submarines and aircraft. More than 1,500 crew members were killed. 153 tanks, 870 aircraft, 430 tanks, 3,500 vehicles, and 99,000 tons of other cargo sank to the bottom. It was a disaster of colossal proportions. The irony was that the Tirpitz never attacked the convoy. The German command recalled the battleship to base, fearing an attack by British aircraft. The tragedy of PQ-17 led to a temporary suspension of Arctic convoys. The British Admiralty recognized that without adequate cover, sending convoys meant condemning them to destruction. The next convoy, PQ-18, would not leave until September, reinforced by an aircraft carrier and powerful escorts. But the lesson had been learned the hard way. The Arctic does not forgive mistakes, and the enemy is ruthless. How many more convoys would be lost on their way to Soviet ports? After the PQ-17 disaster, the protection of Arctic convoys was completely revised. The British Admiralty and the Soviet command understood that without a radical strengthening of the escort, further attempts to conduct convoys would lead to new tragedies. The main problem was the need to protect the convoys from German aircraft based in Norway. To solve this problem, it was decided to include aircraft carriers in the escort, which would provide air cover throughout the dangerous section of the route. Convoy PQ-18, which departed in September 1942, was the first to receive such reinforced protection. It consisted of 40 transports, but now they were accompanied by 2 aircraft carriers, the Avenger and an escort carrier, 2 cruisers, 16 destroyers, and numerous corvettes and minesweepers. In addition, the convoy was met by Soviet ships of the Northern Fleet. The destroyers Gremyashchi, Sokolny, Kuibyshev, and Uritsky left Murmansk and joined the convoy in the Barents Sea. Cover was also provided by Soviet submarines, which took up positions off the Norwegian coast. Soviet aviation of the Northern Fleet played an important role in protecting the convoys. Fighter aircraft patrolled the airspace above the convoys within range of the airfields of the Kola Peninsula. Hurricane and Kitty Hawk fighters received under Lend-Lease as well as Soviet Yaks and MiGs, were scrambled when German bombers appeared. Torpedo bombers struck German bases in northern Norway, attempting to destroy enemy aircraft on the ground. Reconnaissance aircraft constantly monitored the movement of German ships in the Norwegian fjords. Soviet sailors showed exceptional courage in defending convoys. During one of his voyages, Captain Sergei Georgievich Bobkov, commander of the destroyer Sokrat, steered his ship through a minefield to attack a German submarine that was pursuing a transport ship. Risking hitting a mine, the Sokolov dropped a series of depth charges and forced the submarine to surface. The German boat was damaged by artillery fire and withdrew. The transport was saved. For this feat, Bobkov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. The anti-aircraft gunners of Soviet ships fought continuously against German aircraft. During torpedo bomber attacks, anti-aircraft machine guns and large-caliber machine guns fired non-stop, creating a dense fire barrier. On the destroyer Gremyashchi, anti-aircraft gunners repelled 12 air attacks in one sortie, shooting down 3 enemy aircraft. Senior Petty Officer Alexander Fedorovich Shabalin, an anti-aircraft gunner, personally shot down 2 Junkers. When they ran out of ammunition, the crew continued to track the aircraft, passing on their coordinates to other guns. Shabalin was nominated for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The interaction between Soviet and British sailors gradually became more and more coordinated. Initially, there were language barriers and differences in tactics, but combat experience brought the Allies closer together. British liaison officers who spoke Russian were stationed on Soviet ships, and Soviet representatives were stationed on British ships. They coordinated actions, transmitted orders, and assisted in navigation. During joint operations, Soviet and British ships acted as a single unit, covering each other from attacks. Soviet fighter pilots based at airfields in the Murmansk region played a special role. They met convoys as they approached Soviet territorial waters and escorted them to Murmansk or Arkhangelsk. Groups of 4 to 6 fighters patrolled above the convoys, intercepting German reconnaissance and bomber aircraft. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Antonovich Skibnev flew 32 combat missions to cover convoys, shooting down 7 enemy aircraft. He recalled how once his flight intercepted a group of 9 Junkers 88s heading for a convoy. 3 bombers were shot down in the air battle, while the rest turned back without completing their mission. Soviet submarines operating off the Norwegian coast distracted German anti-submarine forces, thereby facilitating the passage of convoys. In July 1942, the submarine K-21, commanded by Captain 2nd Rank Nikolai Alexandrovich Lunin, carried out a daring attack on the Tirpitz as the battleship was leaving to attack convoy PQ-17. Although the torpedoes missed their target, the attack forced the German admiral to turn back, fearing further action by Soviet submarines. This operation became one of the most famous in the history of the Northern Fleet. By the end of 1942, the convoy defense system had been perfected. Losses among transports were reduced, although it was impossible to avoid them completely. Every convoy was accompanied by battles in the air and at sea, and every crossing cost lives. But the cargoes arrived. Tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food arrived at Soviet ports and were sent to the front. Allied sailors paid a high price for this lifeline, but the power survived largely thanks to their courage. How important would the contribution of the Arctic convoys be at the turning points of the war? Arctic conditions turned each convoy into a test not only of the enemy's military power, but also of the forces of nature. The polar night, lasting from November to January, plunged the Barents Sea into round-the-clock darkness. The sun did not appear above the horizon for months. Navigation became extremely difficult. Captains guided their ships by the stars and compass, relying on experience and intuition. Visibility was minimal, and ships sailed almost blindly, keeping their distance by the signal lights of neighboring vessels. The slightest mistake in steering could lead to a collision. The darkness also had its advantages. Convoys sailing in winter were less vulnerable to attacks by German aircraft. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers could not operate in complete darkness. Aiming became virtually impossible. German pilots had to rely on illumination bombs, which were dropped to light up targets. These bombs, flashing with bright magnesium light, turned night into day for a few minutes. Anti-aircraft gunners on escort ships tried to shoot down the illumination bombs before they fully ignited, firing at the parachutes on which they slowly descended. The polar day presented the opposite problem. From May to July, the sun did not set below the horizon, illuminating the sea around the clock. Convoys became visible from enormous distances. German reconnaissance aircraft easily detected the caravans and directed strike forces against them. It was also easier for enemy submarines to attack. They could observe their targets through their periscopes at almost any time. Soviet and British ships were forced to maintain heightened combat readiness around the clock, which exhausted the crews. Sailors did not sleep for 20 to 30 hours at a time during voyages. The storms in the Barents Sea were legendary for their ferocity. Cyclones coming from the Atlantic gathered speed over the open water, creating waves 10 to 15 meters high. Transport ships loaded with heavy cargo struggled to stay on course. Waves washed over the decks, sweeping everything unsecured overboard. There were situations when a ship lost control and dropped out of the convoy, left alone to face the elements. Destroyers and corvettes rushed to the rescue, but they themselves barely stayed afloat in the raging sea. Icing was a deadly danger. At temperatures below -10 degrees and strong winds, sea spray froze instantly, covering the hulls and superstructures of ships with a thick layer of ice. The weight of the ice reached hundreds of tons, disrupting the stability of the ship. The ship became heavy at the top, the center of gravity shifted, and there was a danger of capsizing. The crews fought a constant battle with the ice. Sailors with crowbars, hammers, and axes knocked the ice off the guns, decks, and superstructures. They had to work in the icy wind, on a slippery, swaying deck, risking being washed overboard or getting frostbite. The fog in the Arctic was thick and impenetrable. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Ships lost sight of each other, and the convoy scattered. Captains sounded sirens and horns, trying to determine the location of neighboring ships by sound. But in the fog, the sound was distorted, echoing off icebergs and ice fields, creating the illusion of ships where there were none. Several transports collided with each other in the fog during the war, sustaining serious damage. One British transport, the Botavon, rammed another convoy in thick fog and sank within an hour. Icebergs and ice fields created additional navigational hazards. Summer convoys passed along the edge of the polar ice, where huge ice masses drifted south. A collision with an iceberg could puncture the ship's hull below the waterline, and the ship would sink in a matter of minutes. The watch officers on the bridges constantly scanned the fog and twilight, looking for white masses of ice. The radars of that time did not always reliably detect icebergs, especially small fragments, growlers, that barely protruded above the water but had a huge underwater part. The water temperature in the Barents Sea rarely rose above 4 degrees, even in summer. A person who found themselves in such water without a special suit would lose consciousness from hypothermia in 10 to 15 minutes and die in 30 to 40 minutes. When a ship was torpedoed or bombed, sailors who jumped into the water had little chance of survival. Lifeboats often could not be lowered in time, and even if they were, the rowers quickly lost strength in the icy water. Escort ships rescued those they could, but often had to choose between saving people and protecting the rest of the convoy from continued attack. seasickness decimated the crews of the transports. Constant rocking, especially during storms, caused nausea and vomiting even in experienced sailors. People lost their appetite, weakened, and were unable to perform their duties. On some ships, up to half of the crew suffered from seasickness at some point during the crossing. But there was no stopping. The convoy was on schedule, and those who fell behind risked being left without cover. Captains steered their ships, overcoming their discomfort, while watchmen stood at their posts, clinging to the handrails, ready to faint at any moment. The psychological pressure of Arctic voyages was enormous. The sailors knew the statistics. Every fourth or fifth convoy suffered significant losses. The constant expectation of attack, the inability to relax, the darkness or the blinding light of the polar day, the cold, the rocking of the ship. All this accumulated, wearing down their nerves. But they went on, voyage after voyage, delivering the cargo that was needed at the front. Only a person with an iron will and a sense of duty could endure these conditions. What awaits the submariners of the Northern Fleet, who operate in the same waters but in even more cramped conditions in steel boats? The submariners of the Northern Fleet wrote their heroic chronicle with torpedoes and courage. By the middle of the war, Soviet submarines had become a threat to German communications along the Norwegian coast. One of the most successful commanders was Captain Third Rank Israel Ilyich Fesanovich, who commanded the submarine Shachich 422. From August 1942 to May 1943, he made 6 combat missions, sinking 9 enemy transports and auxiliary vessels with a total displacement of about 20,000 tons. His tactics were daring. He attacked enemy convoys directly in coastal waters, using the complex relief of the seabed to evade pursuit. In October 1942, the Shach 422 spotted a large German convoy of 5 transports in the Varanger Fjord area. Fesanovich decided to attack despite the heavy escort. The boat penetrated the convoy's formation while submerged, maneuvering between the transports. From a distance of 500 meters, 4 torpedoes were fired at 2 targets. 2 torpedoes hit the large transport ship Donau, which was carrying ammunition. The explosion was so powerful that the shock wave was felt on the boat. The Donau sank in 3 minutes. The second target, a tanker, was hit by 1 torpedo and caught fire. Fesanovich took the boat to depth and lay on the bottom while anti-submarine ships hunted for him. The hero of the submarine war was Captain Second Rank Magomet Imadutdinovich Gadzhiev, commander of the K-23 cruiser-class submarine. These large boats, with a displacement of almost 2,000 tons, were capable of long voyages around Scandinavia, to the North Sea and the Atlantic. Gadzhiev carried out several daring operations, attacking German convoys off the coasts of Germany and Denmark. During one of its voyages in January 1942, the K-23 sank 3 transports and damaged a tanker. Gadzhiev was awarded the Order of Lenin and nominated for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. He died tragically on May 12th of that year when his submarine failed to return from another voyage. It is believed that K-23 struck a mine in the North Sea. The feat of Senior Lieutenant Ivan Ivanovich Fesanovich, commander of the submarine M172, occupies a special place in the history of the fleet. In November 1941, his small submarine spotted a German convoy in stormy conditions and limited visibility. Despite the fact that the sea was reaching 7 points on the Beaufort scale, Fesanovich decided to attack in a surface position in order to conserve battery power for the subsequent retreat. The M172 broke through the guard line at full speed, fired 2 torpedoes at a large transport ship, and managed to submerge a few seconds before the German ships opened fire. The transport ship sank, and the submarine escaped pursuit. For this feat, Fesanovich was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Not all voyages ended successfully. Many submarines did not return from combat operations. The Shach 401, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Alexei Mikhailovich Kaufman, was lost in September 1941, presumably after hitting a German minefield off the coast of Norway. The M176 went missing in January 1943. The last radio message reported an attack on a convoy, after which communication was lost. The Shach 421 was lost in September 1943 after a fierce duel with a German anti-submarine ship. The boat was damaged by depth charges and sank with all hands. The submarine K-21, commanded by Captain Second Rank Nikolai Alexandrovich Lunin, became famous for its attack on the battleship Tirpitz. On July 5, 1942, Lunin spotted a German squadron leaving the Alten Fjord to attack convoy PQ-17. The Tirpitz, accompanied by destroyers, was zigzagging at high speed. Lunin decided to attack, even though the conditions were extremely unfavorable. The distance was more than 2,000 meters. The target was moving quickly and maneuvering unpredictably. 4 torpedoes were fired. Lunin observed 2 explosions in the area of the battleship through his periscope, but did not have time to confirm the hits. The German destroyers began pursuit. K-21 went deep and broke away from the enemy. German documents do not confirm the torpedo hits, but the fact of the attack and the courage of the commander remain historical. The submarine crews demonstrated not only courage, but also mutual assistance. In March 1943, the submarine Shach 403 was seriously damaged after an attack with depth charges. The depth controls were damaged, the light plating was punctured, and 1 diesel engine was out of order. The boat barely surfaced, but could not reach the base on its own. Shach 402, commanded by Stolbov, came to the rescue. In stormy conditions and under the threat of enemy attacks, Shach 402 took the damaged boat in tow and brought it to Polyarny. Both commanders received awards for the rescue operation. The submariners lived by the unwritten laws of naval brotherhood. Everyone knew that if their boat was lost, their comrades would do everything possible to avenge the crew. After the loss of Shach 421, boats of the same type carried out a series of revenge attacks in the same area where it was lost. 5 enemy ships were sunk in a month. It was not just a combat score, it was a duty of remembrance to their fallen comrades. On the shore in Polyarny, there was a monument to the fallen submariners, which each crew visited before going on a voyage. Tradition required them to stand silently at the monument, remembering those who did not return from the sea. By the end of 1943, the submarine forces of the Northern Fleet had become a truly formidable weapon. The statistics were impressive. In 3 years of war, submariners sank more than 100 enemy ships with a total displacement of over 300,000 tons. 17 submarine commanders were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, and hundreds of submariners were awarded orders and medals. But most importantly, they disrupted German communications, deprived the enemy of important cargo, and helped protect the Arctic convoys of the Allies. What role would the Marines play in the struggle for the Arctic? The Marines of the Northern Fleet fought where the sea ended and the rocky land of the Arctic began. These fighters were versatile soldiers, equally skilled with shipboard weapons and small arms, able to storm enemy fortifications and repel attacks, land from ships under enemy fire, and hold their ground on coastal heights. At the beginning of the war, the fleet had a Marine brigade of about 4,000 men. As the fighting progressed, its numbers grew to 12,000 fighters, forming several regiments and separate battalions. From the first days of the war, the Marines took up defensive positions on the Sredny and Rybachi peninsulas, key heights controlling the approaches to Murmansk from the north. The German command planned to capture these peninsulas in order to bypass the Soviet defenses and reach the Kola Bay. On June 29th, General Dietl's mountain troops launched their offensive. Elite units specially trained for operations in Arctic conditions were thrown against the Marines. But the Soviet sailors met the enemy with fire from all types of weapons. The heights of Mosta Tunturi and Bolshaya Volokhovaya became the sites of fierce battles. Colonel Viktor Vladimirovich Rasukin, commander of the 12th Marine Brigade, personally directed the defense. He organized a system of strongpoints on key heights, connected by trenches and communication passages. Each hill became a fortress. The Marines dug trenches in the rocky ground, blowing up rocks to create shelters. They set up machine gun nests, mortar positions, and anti-tank guns. The fleet's coastal artillery supported the defense by firing on enemy concentrations. Destroyers approached the shore and fired on German positions with their ships' guns. The Germans attacked wave after wave. Mountain hunters climbed the rocky slopes under fire, trying to bypass strong points from the flanks and break through to the rear of the defenses. But the Marines held their ground. Snipers took out enemy officers and machine gunners. Anti-tank gun crews knocked out the light tanks that the Germans were trying to use to support their attacks. Mortar crews covered the advancing infantry with fire. When the enemy broke through to the trenches, hand-to-hand combat began. The Marines fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and knives, not retreating a single step. Amphibious operations became one of the main methods of action for the Marines. The fleet was able to land small detachments behind enemy lines, disrupting their communications and diverting forces from the main directions. The first major amphibious operation was carried out on July 7, 1941, in the area of Cape Pixuev. A detachment of 200 Marines on torpedo boats and patrol ships landed on the coast occupied by the Germans. The task was to destroy the German coastal observation post and ammunition depot. The landing took place at night, catching the enemy by surprise. After a short battle, the targets were destroyed and the detachment evacuated without significant losses. The largest landing operation was the landing in Bolshaya Zapadnaya Litsa Bay in April 1942. The goal was to create a bridgehead for a subsequent offensive on Petsamo. On April 14th, a reinforced Marine battalion of 800 men landed on the shore from several destroyers and transports. The landing took place under intense enemy fire. The Germans managed to bring in reinforcements and organize a counterattack. Heavy fighting ensued. The Marines held the beachhead for 3 days, repelling 8 attacks. Naval artillery and aircraft supported the landing force, striking German positions. When it became clear that it was impossible to build on their success, the landing force was evacuated. The operation demonstrated the bravery of the Marines, but also revealed the difficulty of conducting large-scale landings in the face of strong opposition. Marines were renowned for their discipline and fighting spirit. Selection for the Marines was strict. Only physically strong, resilient, and psychologically stable fighters were accepted. Training included not only marksmanship, but also special skills such as crossing water obstacles, rock climbing, hand-to-hand combat, and mine and explosive ordnance disposal. The Marines wore dark blue uniforms and black pea coats, which earned them the nickname Black Death from their enemies. German soldiers feared encounters with Soviet Marines, knowing their determination in battle and unwillingness to surrender. Sniper warfare became an important part of the struggle in the Arctic. Marine snipers operated on the front lines, taking out enemy officers, observers, and machine gunners. During 2 years of war, Red Army soldier Ivan Maximovich Sivko killed 128 enemy soldiers and officers. He used a Mosin rifle with an optical sight and was a master at camouflaging himself among rocks and bushes. His favorite tactic was to take up a position at dawn and wait for the enemy to become active. The first shot was aimed at an officer or observer. Then he would quickly change position while the Germans tried to locate the shooter. For his combat achievements, Sivko was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The interaction between the Marines and other branches of the military was perfected. When preparing offensive operations, the Marines received support from artillery, mortars, and tanks. Naval aviation struck enemy fortifications. Ships fired on targets on the coast. During defensive battles, communication with the fleet was maintained constantly. Fire correctors transmitted the coordinates of targets, and within a few minutes, ship guns fired on enemy positions. Such coordination gave the Marines an advantage over the enemy, who lacked such support. By the end of 1943, the Northern Fleet's Marines had become a hardened, experienced force. The fighters had been through dozens of battles, learned to fight in the harsh conditions of the Arctic, and mastered all types of combat operations. The Sredny and Rybachi peninsulas remained in Soviet hands, despite all attempts by the enemy to capture them. The Marines were preparing for decisive offensive operations that were to liberate the entire Arctic from the occupiers. But this required the coordination of all the forces of the fleet. What role would aviation play in the upcoming offensive? The German battleship Tirpitz was a nightmare for everyone responsible for the safety of Arctic convoys. This giant warship, with a displacement of 42,400 tons, armed with 8 380mm guns and 12 150mm guns, could destroy any convoy in a matter of hours. Its speed of 31 knots allowed it to catch up with any merchant ship. Its armor protection made it virtually invulnerable to torpedoes from conventional submarines and bombs from medium bombers. After its completion in January 1941, the Tirpitz became the flagship of the German Kriegsmarine. In January 1942, the battleship was transferred to Norway and anchored in Trondheim Fjord, then moved to Altenfjord, a deep fjord in northern Norway, from where it was convenient to control the routes of Arctic convoys. The mere presence of the Tirpitz in Norwegian waters forced the British Admiralty to assign battleships and aircraft carriers to escort convoys, which were needed in other theaters of war. The German command used the battleship as a fleet in being. It was not necessary to send it into battle. The threat of its deployment was enough to tie down significant enemy forces. The first attempt to attack the convoy with the Tirpitz took place on March 6, 1942. The battleship and destroyers set out to intercept convoy PQ-12, but British intelligence detected the movement of the German squadron. The Royal Air Force launched an attack with albacore torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Victorious. The attack did not damage the Tirpitz, but it forced the German admiral to turn back to base, fearing further airstrikes. The convoy passed unharmed. However, this episode showed how dangerous the threat from the battleship was. The Soviet command understood the significance of the Tirpitz for the fate of the convoys. Repeated attempts were made to destroy, or at least damage, the battleship. The Northern Fleet's aircraft carried out raids on Altenfjord, but the Germans had established a powerful air defense system there. Anti-aircraft batteries covered the battleship with heavy fire, and Messerschmitt 109 fighters patrolled the skies. Several Soviet bombers were shot down while attempting to attack the Tirpitz, but no hits were achieved. The smoke screens that the Germans put up when the planes approached made aiming practically impossible. The submarine K-21, commanded by Captain Second Rank Nikolai Alexandrovich Lunin, made the most daring attempt to attack. On July 5, 1942, Lunin spotted the Tirpitz leaving the Altenfjord, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 8 destroyers. The squadron was heading to intercept convoy PQ-17. The conditions for the attack were extremely difficult. The target was moving in a zigzag pattern at a speed of 25 knots. The distance was more than 2,000 meters, and the escort destroyers were ahead and to the sides of the battleship. Lunin decided to attack, firing 4 torpedoes in a fan pattern, anticipating possible maneuvers by the target. After the salvo, Lunin watched the Tirpitz through his periscope. After the calculated time, he heard 2 muffled explosions and saw columns of water at the side of the battleship. The commander recorded 2 hits in the watch log. However, a fierce pursuit began immediately. The destroyers rushed to the boat's position, dropping depth charges. K-21 sank to its maximum depth and lay on the bottom. The bombing continued for more than 2 hours. About 100 depth charges were dropped. Inside the boat, the lights went out, pipes leaked, and insulation fell from the bulkheads. But the hull held. When the pursuit ended, the boat surfaced and returned to base. German documents do not confirm that torpedoes hit the Tirpitz. Perhaps the explosions that Lunin observed were depth charges dropped by destroyers. Perhaps the torpedoes exploded on impact with the water due to the high speed of the target. Historians still argue about this episode. However, the fact remains that the attack forced German Admiral Otto Schneewin to turn the squadron back. He did not know how many Soviet submarines were in the area and did not want to risk the battleship. The Tirpitz returned to base without attacking the convoy. Lunin received the Order of Lenin and the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for his courage and determination. The British also made several attempts to destroy the Tirpitz. In September 1943, a group of X-craft micro-submarines entered the Alten Fjord and laid mines under the battleship's hull. The explosions damaged the engine room and put the Tirpitz out of action for 6 months. In April 1944, the British Air Force carried out a massive raid. 40 Barracuda bombers attacked the battleship, scoring several hits. Repairs took another 3 months. Finally, on November 12, 1944, heavy Lancaster bombers with 5-ton tallboy bombs delivered the fatal blow. 3 bombs hit the battleship, piercing its armor and causing catastrophic explosions. The Tirpitz capsized and sank in the shallow waters of Tromsø Fjord. About 1,000 crew members were killed. The destruction of the Tirpitz removed the main threat to Arctic convoys. The German fleet no longer had any ships in Norway capable of destroying a convoy on their own. Convoys began to travel with less risk, and security could be relaxed. The freed-up British battleships and aircraft carriers were transferred to other theaters of war. The struggle for the Arctic entered a new phase. Now the main enemies of the convoys were submarines and enemy aircraft. But they too gradually lost their strength under the blows of Allied aircraft and anti-submarine forces. What role would the Northern Fleet's aircraft play in the final phase of the war in the Arctic? The Northern Fleet's Air Force was a universal tool for waging war at sea and on land. At the beginning of the war, the fleet had 116 aircraft of various types, and by mid-1943, this number had grown to 350. The Air Force included fighter, bomber, assault, torpedo, and reconnaissance regiments. Each performed its own specific tasks, but together they created a comprehensive system of air power for the fleet. The aviation was based at the airfields of Vyenga, Gryaznaya, Safonovo, and Pumanki, all of which were located on the Kola Peninsula in close proximity to the theater of war. Fighter aviation provided cover for ships, convoys, and coastal facilities from enemy raids. At the beginning of the war, the fleet was armed with Soviet I-153 Chaika, I-16, and more modern MiG-3 fighters. But the Arctic conditions were harsh on these machines. The engines had trouble starting in the cold, the oil thickened, and the engines had to be warmed up with torches before each flight. In the fall of 1941, British Hurricanes began to arrive under Lend-Lease, which were better suited to northern conditions. Later, American Kitty Hawks and Aerocobras arrived. By the end of the war, the fighter aviation was based on Soviet Yak-9 and La-5 aircraft, which showed excellent performance. The commander of the 205th Fighter Aviation Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Boris Feoktistovich Safonov, became a legend of the Northern Fleet. By May 1942, he had flown 224 combat missions and personally shot down 25 enemy aircraft, with another 14 in his group. Safonov was twice awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. His tactics were aggressive, approaching at minimum distance, firing accurately in short bursts, and using the sun and clouds for surprise attacks. On May 30, 1942, Safonov flew out to cover convoy PQ-16. In an air battle with superior enemy forces, he was shot down and killed. The Safonovo airfield, which became the main fighter base of the fleet, was named after him. Torpedo aircraft struck enemy ships. The fleet was armed with IL-4 and DB-3F torpedo bombers, capable of carrying aircraft torpedoes weighing up to 1,000 kilograms. Torpedo attacks required the highest level of skill. The aircraft had to approach the target at a low altitude of 50 to 100 meters, at a speed of exactly 300 kilometers per hour, and release the torpedo at a distance of 500 to 800 meters. This made the aircraft vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire from the ship. Losses among torpedo bombers were high. Every third sortie could be their last. Captain Nikolai Alexandrovich Tokarev, commander of the torpedo squadron, developed a group attack tactic. 4 to 6 aircraft attacked the target simultaneously from different directions, dispersing anti-aircraft fire. While one pair distracted the enemy, another went on the attack. This tactic proved successful. Losses were reduced, and the effectiveness of the attacks increased. In August 1942, Tokarev's squadron attacked a German convoy off the coast of Norway, sinking 2 transports and damaging a tanker. For this operation, Tokarev was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The assault aviation supported the ground forces and Marines, attacking enemy ground targets. The famous Il-2 Stormers, with their armored hulls and powerful weapons, became a terror for the German troops. They struck concentrations of equipment, warehouses, coastal batteries, and airfields. The RS-82 and RS-132 rockets with which the attack aircraft were armed had a devastating effect. One attack aircraft carried 8 such rockets and could destroy a column of trucks or a battery of guns in a single pass. Reconnaissance aircraft constantly monitored enemy movements in Norway and the Barents Sea. P-3 and MBR-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew daily sorties, photographing enemy bases, detecting ship movements, and locating troop positions. The information obtained by reconnaissance was transmitted to the Fleet Command and used for planning operations. It was the reconnaissance aircraft that were the first to detect German ships leaving the fjords, which made it possible to mobilize forces in advance to counter them. Naval aviators operated in extreme conditions. In winter, at temperatures of -30 degrees, the oil in the engines froze, and the engines had to be heated with hot air from mobile stoves. The runways were covered with ice and snow and had to be cleared by hand. Blizzards disrupted flights for several days in a row. In summer, the polar day allowed flights to be made around the clock, but the engines overheated and the pilots did not get enough sleep. Fog over the sea made navigation difficult. Planes lost their bearings and were forced to return by instruments. The interaction between aviation and surface ships and submarines was carefully worked out. Reconnaissance aircraft transmitted the coordinates of detected targets to submariners, who went out to intercept them. Fighters covered the ships from enemy raids. Torpedo bombers and bombers carried out strikes in coordination with ship artillery. First, the aircraft suppressed anti-aircraft defenses, then the ships finished off the target with fire. This coordination maximized effectiveness. By the end of 1943, the Northern Fleet's Air Force had become a formidable force. Pilots flew more than 50,000 combat sorties, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, and sank or damaged dozens of enemy ships and vessels. More than 100 pilots were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Air supremacy over the Barents Sea passed to the Soviet Air Force. The German Luftwaffe suffered increasing losses, and could no longer operate with the same intensity. The time had come for a decisive offensive to liberate the Arctic. What would 1943 bring for the fleet and troops in the North? The year 1943 was a turning point for the Northern Fleet and the entire war in the North. By this time, the Red Army had seized the strategic initiative after victories at Stalingrad and the Kursk Bulge. In the North, the front had remained stable since the fall of 1941, but the Soviet command was preparing for offensive operations that were supposed to liberate the Arctic from the occupiers. The Northern Fleet received new ships, aircraft, and weapons. The number of personnel grew to 80,000. The combat experience gained over 2 years of war turned the sailors into top-class professionals. The fleet's submarine forces were replenished with new boats. Type C submarines arrived, medium-sized boats with a displacement of 800 tons and 6 torpedo tubes. They were faster and more maneuverable than the Stuka class and had better armament. The crews underwent intensive training, practicing attacks on moving targets, evading depth charges, and operating in minefields. Submarine warfare tactics were improved. Now the boats operated in groups of 2 or 3, coordinating attacks and covering each other. This increased efficiency and reduced losses. Surface forces were also strengthened. New destroyers and patrol boats entered service. Escort destroyers and minesweepers arrived from the United States under Lend-Lease, strengthening anti-submarine defenses. Coastal artillery received new guns with greater range and power. Batteries on the Sredny and Rybachi peninsulas could now control the approaches to Petsamo, the main German base in northern Norway. Radar stations supplied by the Allies made it possible to detect enemy ships and aircraft at long distances, even in poor visibility and polar night conditions. The fleet's aviation achieved quantitative and qualitative superiority over the enemy. By the summer of 1943, there were more than 350 aircraft in service. The Yak-9 and La-5 fighters outperformed the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The pilots gained enormous combat experience, and many became aces, shooting down 10 to 20 enemy aircraft. The ratio of losses in air battles changed in favor of Soviet aviation. Now, for every Soviet aircraft shot down, 2 to 3 German aircraft were lost. Air supremacy passed to the Northern Fleet. Arctic convoys now suffered fewer losses. Reinforced security, air cover, and the destruction of the Tirpitz in 1944 all made the route relatively safer. From January to December 1943, more than 30 convoys arrived at Soviet ports, delivering thousands of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles, as well as hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and food. Murmansk and Arkhangelsk worked around the clock, unloading transports and sending cargo to the front. The importance of the northern route for supplying the Red Army could not be overestimated. Submariners continued their active operations off the coast of Norway. German communications, along which ore from Kirkenes and supplies for troops in the Arctic were transported, were under constant attack. In 1943, Soviet submarines sank more than 30 enemy transports and auxiliary vessels. This disrupted the supply of the German army in Norway, forced it to divert forces to guard convoys, and reduced the enemy's combat power. Each sunken ship meant tons of cargo that did not reach the front, causing problems with food, ammunition, and fuel. The Marines were preparing for decisive amphibious operations. Intensive training was conducted, landing from ships, storming fortified positions, and coordinating with aviation and artillery. The Marines mastered new weapons, PPSH submachine guns, PTRD anti-tank rifles, and Degtyaryov light machine guns. Physical training was perfected. Multi-kilometer forced marches with full load, storming heights, hand-to-hand combat. Every soldier knew that soon they would have to apply all these skills in real combat. Cooperation with the Allies reached a high level. Soviet liaison officers were constantly on British ships, and British officers were on Soviet ships. Joint exercises were conducted, and coordination of actions in repelling enemy attacks was practiced. Soviet pilots flew to cover British convoys, and British sailors shared their experience in anti-submarine warfare. Mutual understanding and trust between the Allies grew stronger with each joint campaign. It was a true combat alliance, sealed with blood and a common goal: victory over fascism. The morale of the fleet's personnel was high. The Red Army's victories in the south inspired the sailors. They knew that the enemy was retreating and that the end of the war was approaching. But there was still a difficult road ahead before victory could be achieved: the liberation of the Arctic, the expulsion of the occupiers from Soviet soil, and possibly their pursuit all the way to Norway. The sailors of the Northern Fleet were ready to carry out any task assigned to them by the command. The spirit of the fleet was not broken by the hardships of war. It was tempered and became stronger than steel. By the end of 1943, everything was ready for the decisive blow. The 14th Army, reinforced with fresh divisions and equipment, took up its starting positions. The Northern Fleet concentrated its ships to support the offensive. The Air Force was tasked with suppressing enemy defenses. Intelligence reported detailed information on the location of German troops, their numbers, and fortifications. The plan of operation was approved by the Supreme Command Headquarters. All that remained was to wait for the order to begin the offensive. When would the hour of liberation come for the Arctic, and what role would the fleet play in this operation? The Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive began on October 7, 1944, and became the crowning achievement of the Northern Fleet's combat operations during the war. The goal of the operation was to liberate the Petchenga region and drive German troops out of the Arctic. The Germans had created a powerful defensive system here. 3 lines of fortifications up to 150 kilometers deep, each saturated with bunkers, trenches, barbed wire barriers, and minefields. The garrison consisted of about 53,000 men of the Wehrmacht's 19th Mountain Rifle Corps, battle-hardened troops who knew the terrain and conditions of the Arctic well. The Soviet command concentrated superior forces. The 14th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Vladimir Ivanovich Shcherbakov, numbered 97,000 men, more than 2,000 guns and mortars, 126 tanks, and self-propelled artillery units. The Northern Fleet assigned all surface ships, aircraft, and marines to support the offensive. Fleet Commander Admiral Arseny Golovko personally directed the fleet's actions. The plan called for a breakthrough of German defenses along a 12-kilometer stretch, followed by an offensive on Petsamo and Kirkenes. Preparations for the operation took months. Reconnaissance thoroughly studied the enemy's defenses, identifying firing points, command posts, and warehouses. The Air Force made hundreds of sorties, photographing the area. Life-size models of German fortifications were created, on which troops practiced their assault. Thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food were delivered. Scouts penetrated the enemy's rear, captured prisoners, and verified data. By the start of the operation, the Soviet command had a complete picture of the enemy's defenses. On October 7th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, the artillery preparation began. 2,000 guns and mortars rained fire on German positions. The roar could be heard for dozens of kilometers. The fleet's coastal artillery struck targets deep within the enemy's defenses. The Air Force struck command posts and reserves. The artillery preparation lasted 2.5 hours. The German defenses were literally plowed under by shells. At 10:30 a.m., the infantry went on the attack, supported by tanks. The Marines stormed the coastal heights, while the rifle divisions broke through the defenses in the center. The Germans put up fierce resistance. The surviving firing points met the attackers with heavy fire. Fierce battles ensued for every hill and every pillbox. But the Soviet troops had a huge advantage in strength and resources. Tanks crushed wire barriers and shot pillboxes at point-blank range. Sappers cleared passages through minefields. Flamethrowers burned out the garrisons in the fortifications. By the end of the day, the first line of defense had been breached in several places. The Germans began to retreat to the second line. On October 10th, the fleet landed a tactical marine assault force behind enemy lines in the area of Cape Krestovi. The purpose of the landing was to intercept the German troops' retreat from Petsamo and assist the main force's advance from the front. The landing force, consisting of 3,000 Marines, boarded destroyers, minesweepers, and landing barges. The landing began at 5 o'clock in the morning with the support of naval artillery and aviation. The Germans put up strong resistance, but the Marines captured a bridgehead and began to expand it, advancing deeper into enemy territory. At the same time, the fleet's aircraft delivered massive strikes against the retreating enemy columns. IL-2 ground attack aircraft attacked concentrations of equipment on the roads, set trucks on fire, and destroyed artillery. Fighters covered the ground attack aircraft from German fighters and attacked ground targets themselves. Torpedo bombers and bombers pounded the port of Petsamo, sinking transports attempting to evacuate troops by sea. In 1 week, the Air Force made more than 1,000 combat sorties, dropping hundreds of tons of bombs and firing thousands of rockets. On October 15th, Soviet troops liberated Petsamo. The Germans continued their retreat to Norway. The pursuit was rapid. The advance units followed close behind the enemy, not allowing them to gain a foothold at intermediate lines. On October 25th, Pechenga was liberated, and on October 25th, Soviet troops entered the Norwegian city of Kirkenes. For the first time in the entire war, the Red Army entered the territory of an Allied state, liberating it from the occupiers. The Norwegian population welcomed the Soviet soldiers as liberators. The flags of Norway and the USSR flew over the liberated cities. The Northern Fleet completed all its tasks. Ships provided fire support to the advancing troops, transported troops and supplies, and evacuated the wounded. The Air Force dominated the skies, destroying the enemy on land and at sea. The Marines fought in the front lines of the advance, demonstrating their bravery and skill. Submarines blocked Norwegian ports, sinking enemy transports attempting to evacuate troops. During the operation, the fleet lost 2 minesweepers, several boats, and about 20 aircraft. These losses were insignificant compared to the success achieved. The Petsamo-Kirkenes operation ended the war in the north. The Arctic was completely liberated. The German army retreated deep into Norway and no longer posed a threat to Murmansk. The northern sea route and Arctic communications were under the complete control of the Soviet Union. Allied convoys could now sail without the risk of attacks from Norwegian airfields and bases. The sailors of the Northern Fleet had done their duty with honor, making a huge contribution to the overall victory. But the war was still going on other fronts, and the fleet remained on combat alert until the very end. What was the final contribution of the Northern Fleet to the victory? The Northern Fleet ended the Great Patriotic War with an impressive combat record and an invaluable contribution to the overall victory. During the 4 years of the war, the fleet's ships, aircraft, and Marines carried out thousands of combat operations, destroyed hundreds of enemy ships and vessels, shot down more than 1,000 aircraft, and liberated the Arctic. But most importantly, the fleet ensured the functioning of the Arctic convoys, through which the USSR received critically important aid from its allies. Without this aid, the war could have dragged on for years and cost millions more lives. The statistics of combat operations are impressive. The submarines of the Northern Fleet carried out 120 combat missions and sank 209 enemy transports and warships with a total displacement of more than 400,000 tons. The Air Force flew more than 100,000 combat sorties, dropped tens of thousands of tons of bombs, sank and damaged more than 200 ships, and shot down 1,300 enemy aircraft. Surface ships carried out hundreds of operations to lay minefields, shell coastal targets, and escort transports. The Marines participated in dozens of amphibious operations and defensive battles. The price of victory was high. During the war, the fleet lost 23 submarines with a total crew of more than 1,000 people. 17 destroyers and patrol ships, dozens of minesweepers, boats, and auxiliary vessels were lost. The Air Force lost more than 1,300 aircraft. Many pilots, sailors, and Marines gave their lives for victory. Their names are engraved on memorials in Murmansk, Polyarny, and Severomorsk. Their memory is sacred to all generations of Northerners. The Allied Arctic convoys became a symbol of international cooperation in the fight against Nazism. From August 1941 to May 1945, 78 convoys arrived at Soviet ports, delivering more than 15 million tons of cargo. These included 4,000 tanks, 12,000 aircraft, 375,000 trucks, and huge quantities of ammunition, food, medicine, and raw materials. Without these supplies, the Red Army would not have been able to launch a counteroffensive so quickly and defeat the Wehrmacht. The Allies paid a high price for escorting the convoys. 85 merchant ships and 16 warships were sunk. More than 3,000 British and American sailors died. Their feat, along with that of the Soviet sailors, is inscribed in the history of victory. The Northern Fleet did everything possible to protect the Allied convoys. Soviet ships and aircraft escorted the convoys, repelled enemy attacks, and rescued the crews of sunken ships. It was a true brotherhood in arms, forged in blood. The heroism of the Northern Fleet sailors was recognized with high awards. 85 people received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union: submariners, pilots, Marines, and ship commanders. 4 became twice heroes: pilot Boris Safonov, posthumously, submariners Israel Fisanovich and Magomet Gadzhiev, posthumously, and pilot Alexei Shabalin. Tens of thousands of sailors were awarded orders and medals. 47 ships, units, and formations received the Guards title. The Northern Fleet itself was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. The experience of the Northern Fleet became invaluable for the development of the Soviet Navy. Submarine warfare tactics in Arctic conditions, the organization of convoy operations, the interaction of diverse forces, and amphibious operations were all studied in military academies and schools. The Northern Fleet proved that even a small fleet, with the right organization and high morale, can solve strategic tasks and resist a superior enemy. After the war, the Northern Fleet continued to develop and grow stronger. It became the main nuclear missile force of the USSR during the Cold War, acquiring nuclear submarines, missile cruisers, and aircraft carriers. The base in Severomorsk became the country's largest naval base, but the foundation was laid during the Great Patriotic War, when the young fleet underwent its baptism of fire and proved its combat capability. The memory of the war is sacred in the north. In Murmansk, there is the Alyosha Memorial, a monument to the defenders of the Arctic, visible from dozens of kilometers away. In Polyarny, there is a monument to the heroes of the submarine fleet, a black granite stele with the names of those who died. The Northern Fleet Museum in Severomorsk preserves relics of the war: flags, awards, photographs, and documents. Every year on May 9th, the dwindling number of fleet veterans gather at the monuments to honor the memory of their fallen comrades. During the war, the Northern Fleet showed what it means to serve the motherland in the harshest conditions: the cold of the Arctic, the storms of the Barents Sea, the polar night, and a superior enemy. Nothing broke the spirit of the sailors. They fulfilled their duty to the end, defended Murmansk, ensured supplies for the Allies, and liberated the Arctic. Their feat is part of the Great Victory, which was won with the blood and sweat of millions of Soviet people. The memory of this feat will live forever.